Lead them through the valley of the shadow of death and into the light, and strengthen them for whatever travails they face. Lord, we ask you strengthen us too by the power of your word, and draw us towards a right understanding of it, that we may be better formed in faith and love. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so what is everybody interested in here? How do we think we want to go forward?
Yeah, I want to see the film.
I will go with whatever the group decides. That's really a coward's way out, isn't
Try to be
it?
in control.
You said that. You said at the beginning you
I'm
don't like to
not-
be in control. Okay.
Not a controller.
That's the thought.
If everybody wants a movie, that's fine.
Okay. Then what I might do.
Do we have popcorn?
All right, let's see.
Okay, the movie's out, and there's no popcorn. The movie's out.
For those who are streaming, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be watching a YouTube video. And what I'm going to see if I can do, we'll see if it works. I'm going to see if I can get it to pop up on the television from here so that it can be
Yeah.
watched. But I'll include a link in the program notes when it's all said and done if it doesn't work.
I looked on Wikipedia. I looked on Google. I found Timothy Mahoney, but I couldn't get the free link. Again, I don't know what happened.
Where did we find it free?
I thought it was Google,
Hmm.
but it might have been, well, YouTube, huh?
All right. So let's see.
This is free.
Aha, look at that. It's working. It's not working the way I want it to, but it is working. So one thing at a time. Display. Extend. Book. All right, first thing first. That's good. Now, I'm going to see if I can blow the whole thing up for everybody to see. No. Dun, 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 dun. Display capture. That's the one. I just need to add the audio so they can hear us online. Alrighty. Now we're going to hope this works. Okay. Always learning how to do these things is the trick. Yeah, so this is from this is a video from one of my favorite podcasts. I don't always listen to it. It is a Catholic podcast, so occasionally it's useful and sometimes it's not. But this is from an episode of a show called Pints with Aquinas. And I find it to be...
What about things like Sodom and Gomorrah?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Bergsma.
That is one of the most sensational stories
Sum
in,
it up for
in
those
recent
who
history.
not as aware as they should be.
Yes. Okay. I mean, so Sodom and Gomorrah, it looks like one of those mythological stories out of the Bible, right? Oh, yeah, sure. You know, fire comes from heaven. Yeah, tell me another one.
Pause. All right. All right, come over here. I just have to get volume, right? I'm not hearing any volume over here. It says it's 100. There's another way to do this if we don't get it well.
What about things like Sodom and Gomorrah?
Sodom and Gomorrah. That is one of the most sensational stories
Sum
in,
it up for
in
those
recent
who
history.
not as aware as they should be.
Yes. Okay. I mean, so Sodom and Gomorrah, it looks like one of those mythological stories out of the...
over to this computer. That's all right. That'll let Pines for if you want to see it in full motion, people with Pines for Aquinas can come see it then. You can go watch it on his channel. Okay. So we'll do this another way. Let's see. Source. PC. PC. Okay. Guess this is the one. There it goes.
Does anybody go to the class on C.S. Lewis?
That Lisa's going to
Thursday?
have?
Oh, going to have.
She's going to begin
Oh.
it next
Yeah, it hasn't
week, I
started
think, next
yet.
week, I believe,
Do you have
on a
to-
Thursday,
Okay, right, at 1 o'clock. Do
correct?
you have to read something before it?
No.
No, I don't think.
No, you're reading in class.
Okay.
Yeah, I think they're planning with Mere Christianity. They're just going to work their way through it.
Do I have to sign up for that?
That I don't know.
She's not going.
I don't know. I didn't see any sign-up sheets out there for it.
No, you can show. You're welcome to just show up. I'm sure she'd be ecstatic if anybody did. It's always when you're starting something new that it's a slow thing. You know,
Sure.
like to get started, people forget for several weeks they meant to do it, and now they finally, oh yeah, that's
Who
what
is
we
she?
do. I'm sorry.
Who is she? You said she'll be glad.
My wife.
Oh.
Yeah, she'll be glad if anyone shows up for the discussion.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
computer's still thinking here. Just booting up.
Yeah, it's spinning.
Yes. The spinning wheel of death, as my children like to call it. Now, you don't want to watch cable. Here we are. Ta-da! Now this should work without a problem. Not the one I wanted. There you go.
What about things like Sodom and Gomorrah?
Sodom and Gomorrah. That is one of the most sensational stories
Sum it up for
in
those
recent
who
history.
are not
Yeah.
as aware as they should be.
Yes. Okay. I mean, so Sodom and Gomorrah, it looks like one of those mythological stories out of the Bible, right? Oh yeah, sure. You know, fire comes from heaven. Yeah. Tell me another one. And I'll be honest with you, Matt. When I was growing up and reading Genesis 19 and stuff like that, it was a challenge to my faith. I'm like, okay, come on, really? You know, did this really happen? Or are we supposed to understand this something else? But so several years ago now, maybe like 15 years ago, I was at the Society of Biblical Literature, which was being held in that year in San Francisco. And I was in one of these, conference rooms, and I just wandered into this session because it had an intriguing title, something about archaeological discoveries at Tel El Hammam in Jordan. I thought, well, I'll walk into this, because a lot of these conferences at the Society of Biblical Literature, like these ideologically driven, post-colonial, feminist, whatever, interpretation of this, that, or the other thing. So I like to go to ones that are actually about language or history or something. Somebody actually dug something up and we're talking about data, So this archaeological session I wander in. I start listening, and as I'm listening to this presentation for about 45 minutes, near the end of it, I began to realize, oh my gosh, these people presenting think that they have found the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what they're saying in a really roundabout, really understated way. So at the end of the presentation, they stop the presentation and they open up for questions, and they describe these two city mounds that they had found on the Jordanian side of the Jordan River, and in this destruction layer and so on. And so I raised my hand immediately and I said, well, did you find any arrowheads? The reason I ask that, Matt, is when you have a destruction layer of an ancient city, if you find arrowheads in the destruction layer, it means that an army caused the destruction and they were shooting arrows at the defenders and blah, 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 blah. If you find a destruction layer and there aren't arrowheads, that means an army did not destroy the city, and then probably it was some kind of natural event, right? So I'm curious, like, what destroyed these two cities that you guys think are Sodom and Gomorrah? And so the researcher starts to get very bashful when I ask this question. He says, well, I don't really want to go there, but all I want to say while we're recording this session is that it was a heat event. And there's like 20 other people in the room, and we're like looking at each other like, a heat event? Like, is that like a wardrobe malfunction? Like, what is a heat event? You know, they're like, okay, and then he stopped the recording, like the official session was over, you know, and so it was like off camera at this point. So all of us in the room like mobbed the guy at the front, like, okay, you know, tell us what's going on. And so this researcher, Stephen Collins he's from a southwestern university in the U.S. here, he says, okay, so we get down to this destruction layer of this city that we're beginning to think is Sodom, and we pulled up a piece of pottery, and when I looked on one side of it, I thought, oh no, our research is ruined, because I saw that it was glazed. And glazing wasn't invented until the Ottoman period, or at least the kind of glazing that he thought he saw. And the Ottoman period is like 1000 AD. And if you're pulling that up, that means you've got contamination in your archaeological dig. You got like later artifacts down there. But then he turned the pottery over, and on the back of it, it was typical Bronze Age pottery. But it was glazed on one side and not on the other. Like, what on earth is going on? So make a long story short, he sends this away to a lab in the US and for testing, and they come back and say, well, that glazing is trinitite. Okay, great. What's trinitite? Well, trinitite is that glass layer that you get when you basically set off an atomic bomb in the desert, and it melts the glass, and you get a kind of crystalline formation that's called trinitite. So this pottery was raised to over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit for a brief moment of time. Like, oh my gosh, this is what's going on. So they continue to bring up this glazed pottery, and eventually what they discover is, among other things, they also begin to find human remains. They find human skeletons that are complete up until about halfway up the backbone, and then there's just a scorch mark, and there's nothing on the top of the body. And they find the skeleton behind a wall that's about, 4 feet high. So what's going on here? Well, long story short, they find massive evidence that a huge heat blast from the sky at about 25 degrees above the horizon incinerated these twin cities on the Jordanian side of the river, just north of the Dead Sea. Yeah, and they have the artifacts to prove it.
And again, the reason it has to be from the sky?
What's that?
The reason it had to be from above is...
Because of the angle, like they have these human remains that apparently were standing upright behind a wall, and everything above the wall was incinerated, and they do like the angular calculations, and they can see, oh, that blast was coming like this, so they can calculate the angle at which, and the stuff when they find the stuff in situ, and they've got a scorched side or a melted side, again they can triangulate where this was coming from. And so, long story short, from a natural material explanation, this looks like a meteor blast.
Okay. That's what I was about to ask. What was the naturalistic explanation?
Yeah, like in Tunguska, I think it was called Siberia back in the 1800s. There was this massive meteor blast that flattens several hundred square miles of taiga, of northern Russian forest and so on. And when a meteor comes into the atmosphere, it heats up and then explodes, and it can be like an atomic blast. But again, the timing and the location and the cities all track with what is described of Abraham and Lot in Genesis 19 and the surrounding chapters. And then the Bible talks a lot about Sodom and Gomorrah for centuries thereafter, all the way into the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah continue to mention Sodom and Gomorrah. This stuck in the cultural memory because this was a major world historical traumatic event for us, like the two towers going down, like this major disaster where these two cities were entirely wiped out by a heat blast from the sky, by the hand of God, as it were. But no historical source records this, even though Sodom and Gomorrah were arguably the two most powerful cities in that entire region. They were at a trade route, from going from east to the west, from Egypt out to, the Far East, and everything was passing through there. So very powerful, very wealthy cities, and only the biblical record, has a historical account of this, meteorological, geological event that we can now attest that tracks with the time period and the description. And also that blast going up creates a great vacuum, which then recollapses and pulls all kinds of salt sediment from the Dead Sea and then slams it on that location that was in the bullseye of, and that's where you get, the discussion of, became a pillar of salt and all the hellfire, the brimstone, that was all torn up by the blast and redeposited over the cities. So it's absolutely fascinating. Folks can look this up. I'm not making this up. Steve Collins, a very reputable archaeologist from something like Southwestern Methodist University or something like this. You can look online, just go to Amazon and type in the discovery of Sodom and Gomorrah in his book. I forget the exact title.
Thursday's on it.
But you can find it and put a link to it.
Wow.
And that really changed my perspective on the Old Testament, Matt, because what it pointed out to me is things that sounded too outlandish to be history, that even I as a believer was tempted to discount, suddenly and sensationally shown to be, actually that's a historical event.
Now, do you think it was a meteor? Do you think that a Christian can say it was a meteor and it's God using the meteor to...
Absolutely.
I see.
I think that's, the providence is in the timing. I mean, that's the timing of God. It's like
if you're a sinner and you walk into a church and get struck by lightning.
Right. That was just a naturalistic. No, these things are in the hands of God.
Wow.
So I don't see any conflict there.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, do us a favor, leave a comment, let us know what you thought of.
All right. Turn that off. All right. So what'd you think of that? A little strange?
I never thought of it being an asteroid.
No.
That makes sense.
Yeah, well, it does. We'll see that there's a blast from the air, right? This kind of thing. You see the fire coming down from heaven. Isn't that fascinating, though? For years, and these are the kind of things we can't find any evidence for. This has been the stuff that has wrecked the faith of lots of people who go off to seminary. They don't stop being. They don't choose not to be a pastor, but they go to seminary and they hear that. Well, we know most of this stuff. It's just sort of. These are good moral, mythical stories, but they're not actual history, and we don't need to think of them that way. But of course, that people start playing games in their mind as they do that. So they end up seeking a different explanation for everything they don't like in the Bible. Then, right? I mean, 'cause this is an uncomfortable story. It's a very uncomfortable story, we prefer to think of Jesus the way he's pictured in a lot of 19th century paintings, with sort of a soft glow around him, and not as the God who reveals himself in the burning bush or in the destruction of these cities and this kind of thing. And he's both. He's both. He does offer mercy, but he's also the God of justice. And I always laughed when I see some of those pictures that are so, the ones my grandmother loved. I think to myself, I never see a picture of Jesus cleansing the temple with a cord of whips. that's not one that you see lots of for sale signs on, kind of things. So, there's for those joining us online as well. There's a much more extended interview. You heard him talking about Steve Collins. I didn't want to run that one with us. That's a full hour and 10 minutes. Sean McDowell has that. He has a podcast out of Biola, but his YouTube channel, so it's spelt in the Irish way, SEAN, Sean McDowell. He has an apologetics podcast, and he does an interview with Professor Steve Collins, and goes into more detail. When they talk about that piece of trinitite being sent off, what actually happened was that you had a retired guy excavating on the dig, and he had worked with the Manhattan Project. So he recognized it instantly. And they thought, no, he must be wrong. He's just a volunteer after all, and we're in the wrong layer. It can't be from a nuclear blast. Well, the reason why you end up with a very particular structure of trinitite is that you heard that 4,000 degrees. But it's instant and gone. It's not like a kiln where it rises up slowly. Like when you fire bricks, the old-fashioned way of firing bricks, you basically build a building out of all this clay stuff and then set fires outside of it till the bricks all fire out. That takes days to get the process done. And even if you're smelting iron or anything else, it takes a long time to get your temperature up that high. And you're never going to get up to 4,000. You're never going to get it up to 4,000. So this is what they actually call this is an aerial blast. It's when the meteor detonates before hitting the ground, and that the heat gets so hot that it explodes. And that's why they were able to calculate the angle, as they said, that it was coming in. But it should tell you something about groups like, he mentioned this was at a Society of Biblical Literature meeting, that the professor in question didn't want to talk about this because it would either ruin his professional reputation, to basically say, yes, it looks like the Bible's quite literally true on this issue. It just tells you what the state of things are in the academy, where if you take the perspective that Scripture should essentially be trusted rather than be essentially suspected of being false, being pious stories, you endanger your professional standing by doing that. So I'll just let you know where things are right now. Do you guys have any questions as you watched? Anything that you wanted to ask me questions about?
Well, is this, no, jump ahead here, but.
Sure.
I did see something on one of these interviews, it was just a little blurb, about the Red Sea and the parting of the Red Sea, and how that's considered a miracle. I mean, you can't prove it.
Of course, yeah.
And so this would be considered a miracle.
Yes. It's one of those things that, and this is important, just like when we studied the Tower of Babel, right? We talked about this as the Jewish retelling of the collapse of the Bronze Age. Okay, this is the collapse of the first Babylonian Empire into chaos. This is their telling of that story. What's important about the Old Testament is it's not the history it recounts, because the history would be public. Everyone would have known about the destruction of those two cities. Everyone would have at the time. There were actually, I think, 7 cities that are listed out in the back in Genesis 18. We have to go back a chapter and check. But these two are singled out as having been destroyed. Everyone would have known about that. It was a public event. What the Scripture records for us is the divine authorship of that event. Helps us understand that God was the one behind what happens. Just like you're going to get when you get to the destruction of the cities in the book of Joshua. It was very, very interesting, along with the redating of the Exodus that Mahoney and people like him are advocating for. There are actual records of the Canaanites writing letters back to Egypt. And now these would validate the new dating of Exodus that Mahoney is advocating for. This would be, I believe, under Pharaoh Amenhotep, I think the third. But it's very, very interesting. There's right around the period of the Exodus, like it would have been just afterward, he basically goes on raiding parties to collect slaves. But he's raiding countries he already has an alliance with, specifically the Canaanites. So the Canaanites at the time of the Exodus remember we talked about that suzerain vassal treaty that we talked about in Genesis 15, right? You've got the higher king and the lower king. The lower king makes an agreement, we'll pay you, the higher king, tribute, but you protect us. So they actually have the letters now that the Canaanites are writing back to Egypt saying, we have this treaty, they're destroying our cities, come fix it. But Egypt's not in a position to do so because they've lost a huge amount of their armed forces. Also, you don't raid your neighbor that you have an alliance with. You don't raid them for slaves unless all of a sudden your economy is collapsing because it's based on slave labor and you've lost all your slaves. And why choose the Canaanites? Well, that's what the Israelites were. They're from Cana. So the God who rules in Cana is going to deprive us of slaves. Guess who we're going to enslave? We're going to go back to these other. Now these are the tribes who the Israelites are going to be making war against in the book of Joshua. But Egypt is going and raiding them and bringing back slaves from the groups we're going to start thinking of as the Amalekites and the Amorites and the Hittite, all the groups that you see named in these early books of the Old Testament. That's who Egypt is going up to raid and bring back as slaves because they look the same. I mean, when they found, I mentioned to you the small burial pyramid that we think might be for Joseph. What reason do we think it might be for Joseph? Well, there's 12 pillars around it to symbolize the 12 brothers, or the 12 tribes. But also, you got, when I say sarcophagus, you know what I mean? You've seen the Egyptian things. The actual mummy's inside. Then there's a larger box, and then the sarcophagus is around that. That's the really decorative one. Well, you've seen them where their hands are like this, and they're holding the different symbols. What he's holding aren't the symbols that Egyptians hold. He's holding a shepherd's crook on one side, and he's carrying some. I forget what he's on the other side. But main thing is the complexion is lighter. So these people had a different complexion from the Egyptians, the native Egyptians. And so, hey, all these slaves who just left and their God kicked our butt, and there's a name for them. Later on, that name just comes to mean barbarians or people who are attacking us. But at this period of time, it means a very specific ethnic group. And it turns out it probably was the Jews. I think it's the Ihropa is what they were calling them. The Ihropa keep attacking us. And they've sacked this city, they've sacked this city, that, and it's weird because they do things like when they think the same way that there were things that verify the account here. When they find what they think was the biblical Jericho, very specific things are listed in the biblical account. Of course, we all think of the walls falling down, right? Because that's the old song, and it's a fight song at football games and all that stuff, right? Well, and most of us know that 3 walls collapse in and 1 collapses out, right? But those are some very specific things. There is that it happens right after harvest time. So now that's interesting. Very specific that it happens right after harvest time. Also, it says that after the walls collapse, the people meaning the Israelites, can simply climb up into the city. They simply run up. So what they found as they were excavating, 2 really interesting things. One is that there's a burn layer. That burn layer indicates that the whole city was burned. There's nothing that was left, okay? Which is verified by the Joshua accounts also. But they find that 3 walls collapsed inward, 1 outward. The one that collapses outward, it's a double wall system. That's why it was so imposing. If you breach the first wall, you're stuck in a gap between the walls where they can just shoot at you from the top, okay? These other walls collapse outward like this and form a ramp. They can just walk right up and into the city. They also find, as they dig down, yes, the city was torched, but of course, where do you store grain and other things? They had dry cellars, just like this area used to be full of root cellars, right? You stuck your potatoes and your onions in there to survive the winter. Well, that's where all the grain was. So the grain doesn't get torched. They find all of these giant jars, and they're still full of grain because the harvest just came in. Now, what that tells you is 2 things. not just the time of year it happened, but it tells you that there wasn't a long siege because all that food would have gotten eaten down. So most sieges in the ancient world last months or even years to break the spirit of the people inside till they finally gave up, or they got so weak you could win. So this particular siege apparently didn't last long, like 7 days.
7 days.
So all of this stuff is verifying the details of the accounts that are found in the Bible, but also what the Bible provides us that even a detailed historian on the site a modern historian on that site at that time wouldn't be able to provide for us is the commentary on how God is the actual actor behind the events in question. These are not just natural occurrences. A meteor could be a natural occurrence, but the timing of it, that God chooses it to happen when he does, is where you see the hand of God active. That's not new theology. That's very, very old theology. The church has always looked around, and this would go back to the Jews before the church, and say, of course God can use the things of this world. Of course, what looks to us like natural occurrences are in fact the hand of God. This is why the church fathers, riffing on Romans 8, which we'll hear referenced this coming Sunday at the Pet Blessing, will say, yeah, there was a storm at sea because we sinned. They're not being tongue-in-cheek about it. They mean it in a very literal sense. Through our sin, the power of death and chaos enters the world, and that right now that looks like a storm at sea that took down a whole ship full of people we love. But it's our fault because it wouldn't be like this if we hadn't sinned. Now they're not necessarily saying God's punishing a particular sin with that. They're saying that all the darkness we experience in our world, we live in a broken world. The world's under a curse, a la Genesis 3. But that's our fault because we didn't act as the priests to creation that we were supposed to be. So it's always been the theology of the church that God can use what we would call natural occurrences because we don't think with a supernatural mindset anymore. We only think it's supernatural now if it's defying the laws of physics or nature. And the people of God throughout most of time had said, no, of course God's the maker of heaven and earth, as we say in the creeds, right? All things visible and invisible. So of course he can order those things as he wishes to order them. There are miracles that break the laws of physics or genetics in the case of Jesus' conception. But even there, those are the exception. As you look at most of the miracles of the Old Testament, to your question, most of them could easily be thought of as natural occurring things. But of course, then the timing of them is why at that moment, the people of God say it's because God wanted them to happen at that moment for a specific purpose. I've seen so many theories. Long before I became a Christian, there was a Russian astrophysicist who had an entire theory about the origin of the planet Venus, and it came from the story of the parting of the Red Sea. In a nutshell, his theory, I can't remember his name right now. I for years had it committed to memory because I read it when I was like 12. I found it the most fascinating thing ever. My dad brought home this book. It was really fascinating. If you know anything about the solar system, you know that Venus rotates opposite of all the other planets. So you know how, like, if you send the water down your drain, it spins one way north of the equator and one way south of the equator? So the idea, of course, being from a naturalistic perspective, that what gave us the solar system we had was an original cloud. As gravity collapses the sun, it starts to spin, and you get all these little eddies, and the eddies form the planets. So they're little, as they spin, centrifugal force brings everything together. Gravity brings them together, rather, not centrifugal force. Brings them together, and you get the planets. Well, every planet rotates the same way the Earth does, except Venus. Venus rotates backward. And so most of us know also that the great red spot on Jupiter is a storm that's lasted for several centuries. It wasn't always there. We know from the observations of ancient cosmologists who were working just with lenses and things like this, what little they could do, that we know of a time when the red spot wasn't there. It actually started at a particular moment. A lot of theories, not just this crazy Russian guy, a lot of theories believe that was caused by an impact, some sort of giant thing hitting Jupiter and starting that storm because Jupiter is mostly gas the whole way down. It takes a long time till the gas gets pressurized enough to turn to liquid and then to solid. So this guy's theory was that essentially that impact caused a spin-off. If you drop water into a cup, you know how it bounces out. The stuff that bounces out, here's your test. You can try it with a creamer. Drop it into your cup of coffee and watch what bounces out. It's what went in is what came out. What you dropped in is what comes out, not the liquid around it. So his theory was that something hit Jupiter and bounced back out, and that became Venus. But Venus orbited weirdly, almost like a comet does, in an erratic orbit, a long elongated orbit, for several rotations around the sun before it finally settled in where it is now. And that one of those passes came near the Earth. And that the static electricity between Venus and the Earth caused the opening of the sea. And the Israelites went through, and then it came back together. So that was this was this guy from Russia's theory back in the 70s. And he dated it because of but the whole idea came from the Red Sea crossing. Now, he wasn't a Christian or a Jew. Neither one of those were something you really wanted to own up to being in the Soviet Union. But he was using this, just looking at the Bible as an ancient document that recorded some details he wanted to work with as a scientist. So, and I've seen lots of other theories over time that, what we describe as the Red Sea could also be the Reed Sea. The word is indeterminate in Hebrew. A reed sea, an ocean of reeds, would be by definition shallow, and that you could have a breeze blowing overnight, and we do have that in the Bible. You have the breeze blowing, would actually push the water out, so it would be, and you'd actually kind of form like we think of like a storm swell on either side, and then when the breeze stopped, it would come back together and wipe out who was ever in the middle. So again, all these are just naturalistic ways of explaining what the Bible looks at and says, look what God did.
Right, this guy from Russia, was he an astrophysicist?
Yeah, he was a cosmologist, I think.
Cosmo.
Yeah, like a Carl Sagan type. So.
And what were you before you were Christian? Jewish?
No, I was pretty indeterminately nothing.
That was a joke.
No, I wasn't. I had kind of decided a pox on all their houses by the time I got to college, and then I read a book that convinced me of the existence of God.
Which was?
It wasn't a book that intended to do that.
Yeah.
It was called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought he proved the existence of God, although he clearly didn't mean to.
Uh-huh.
And that started me searching, but it took about 4 more years till I settled in Christianity. So I was on my way to being a Christian pretty firmly by the time we were married, but I really settled into my faith, and we got married in June, and I would identify myself as a Christian by October.
Mm-hmm.
So, yep, 1995. So, I'm kind of like C.S. Lewis though, where some people when they become a Christian can tell you like the moment, the date, what they were doing, and I'm more like C.S. Lewis, where he was on a bike ride. And he said, at the beginning of the bike ride, I wasn't a Christian, and by the end of it, I was. There was obviously a long journey that led him there, and all these conversations with all these people over the years, but it's very different than what I experienced. So, yeah.
There's one thing I can't understand, though.
Mm-hmm.
Anthropologists, scientists, etc., are in search of truth.
Yes.
Why are they firmly convinced that the Bible isn't the truth?
Because the short answer is because all fields go through fashions, not just clothing. There's fashions, there are intellectual fashions in various sorts, and everybody wants the respect of their peers. So in the world of scholarship, that's how you get money. You can't just do disinterested research. That's theoretically why we have what do you call it when you can't be fired? Tenure.
Yeah.
Theoretically, the reason you have tenure is that you can do disinterested research without having to worry about whether you'll get fired for doing it. But doing disinterested research requires you to have money beyond spending your own money you use to put food on the table. And so you have to apply to foundations who curate all this stuff. Well, you can't get money for certain types of research. No psychologist today can get research on the origins of homosexuality. They could have in the 1960s. They can't now. There is no research grant you can write to get that someone will say, yeah, we want somebody looking into that issue. They don't want to touch it. It's the same way in the naturalistic sciences regarding certain things about, for instance, evolution. Most people don't. There's a massive crisis. Almost all the top level biologists agree that Darwin's theory doesn't work. It absolutely does not work, mathematically speaking. Not you can tell a nice story, but it doesn't work mathematically. There's not enough time between the origin of life, or life moving from single cell to multicellular to end up with the biodiversity we have. There's just not enough time. But they're not ready to let God back in the picture, because as I forget who said this. They said, but Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. Creation was the one thing that kept you from becoming an atheist. But functionally, a lot of the founders of the United States were functionally atheists. But you couldn't be a respectable atheist because you couldn't explain how we got all the stuff we have, right? So most of them were what we would be Aristotelian. So Aristotle's theory was that you had a prime mover unmoved. So think of it as a long chain of dominoes all the way back to beginning, everything we've ever experienced. God is the one who pushes the first domino, but then he doesn't do anything after that. He just pushes and he sits back and watches. So that immediately discounts any interference or any interaction between God and his creation. That's what the dominant theories were at the time of the Enlightenment. There's a reason why the French Revolution went radically differently than the American Revolution, was because America was largely founded by committed Christians coming over and forming a colony. Remember, the original colonies didn't have freedom of religion, except for Pennsylvania, because William Penn was a Quaker, and he wanted to make sure everybody had freedom of religion. But if you went to Massachusetts, you were a Puritan.
Yeah, you were a Puritan.
There was you had no freedom. The Church of England was not welcome in Massachusetts. It was by colony. So you had these really committed religious people in America when colonies became states. That was not true in France. The French Revolution was radically anti-clerical. They took over Notre Dame, which means Our Lady, and made it into the Temple of Reason. They inverted the meaning of the sacraments. I just came across a reference where a very famous actress during the French Revolution called Republican marriage, meaning marriage under the government rather than in the church. She called that what did she call it? The sacrament of adultery, because it was fully expected that marriage had no purpose other than to produce legitimate heirs. But otherwise, it was a sexual free-for-all. And this was the 1700s. We think of the 1960s. No, this is the 1780s. So it was radically anti-clerical. Which is why you ended up with people, what we would think of as the foundations of modern political conservatism, are responding to the French Revolution in the British Parliament. Whether that be people like William Wilberforce, who were working for the freeing of the slaves and the reform of education. He did a lot. That's the other thing. Most people know Wilberforce for helping to get rid of the slave trade, and that was William Wilberforce. Mm-hmm. It was his life's work to get rid of the slave trade in the British Empire, and he succeeded literally days before his death. Mm-hmm. But he and his wife also worked for strong educational reforms, particularly educational opportunities for women and the poor. That was their other big thing they worked on their entire lives. A lot of his writings form the basis of modern political conservatism, along with, I should know his name. Brain's skipping a beat. Can't remember his name. Anyway, it was all in reaction. You'd know his name as soon as I said it, but it's not coming to my brain. All their writings were reactions against what was happening in France. They didn't want the violence that they were seeing in France to cross the channel and come to England. They still had a king, but they also had a parliament. And they had the British common law tradition meant even the king stood under the law, not above it, which was different than France. France didn't have a common law tradition. It's called common law because it's in common to everybody, peasant and king alike. So it's a very different understanding of the relationship of the monarchy to the people than you had in France. In France, you had the concept of divine right. God picked this person to be your tyrant, deal with it. And they were desperately afraid of the violence crossing the channel because there were active attempts to do it. It was just like the modern Marxists, where they go from country to country trying to get a Marxist revolution going. So it was very, very much like that, and it's in the same vein. So,
It's a shame we don't have politicians under the law too.
yeah. Theoretically, but yeah,
Yeah.
theoretically is what causes revolutions, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And there were abuses that need. I mean, anybody, if you've read the novels of Charles Dickens, things were bad. Especially as the Industrial Revolution got going, things were really bad in the cities. The workers' conditions for poor people were horrible, and so there was a real opportunity for early in the century, the French Revolution style revolutionaries, and as you crossed over the midway point of the century, Marxists really actively trying to get a Marxist revolution going in England, and that's why we're dealing with some of what we're dealing today in America. Is that there was a group called the Frankfurt School, a guy named Herbert Marcuse, who was imprisoned by the fascists in Italy, and he spent his time in prison doing what St. Paul did, writing letters. And he basically said, why did we fail in England? It worked in Russia. And conditions were just as appalling in England. Why did we fail in England when we succeeded in Russia? And the answer that he came up with was that the English were too connected to their families and their churches. So you have to systematically break the connection between family. And I say connections, not just love, but responsibility, right? I have a responsibility to my family, which is mostly my local community, right? And what does my local community center around in England? The parish church, right? So if you can break people's attachment to their faith and their attachment to their family, then you've got a right, and that's what has been, and so he called for what he called the long march through the institutions. So the institutions had to be flipped to become Marxist first, and then you'd set the stage for the Marxist revolution. And that's largely what we're facing right now. The reason why you're hearing all this stuff about racism is that they took Marxist theory and applied it over into racial relations. Marxist theory was organized around the conflict between social classes, which meant money, functionally. Another reason it failed in America historically is that, and you know this if you watch British comedies, very class conscious. Half of British comedy and British serious drama too is reflections on the distinctions between upstairs, downstairs, right? That was a long-running series out of Great Britain. The working class and the downstairs group and the upstairs who were served by them. Fawlty Towers is like that too. Basil Fawlty is always trying to prove he's in part of the upper class and he's not. And what was the other one? Keeping Up Appearances. Keeping Up Appearances. I mean, she was a first-class comedian, very physical comedy like Lucille Ball, right? She was one of the few who could really take a pratfall. And it's all that kind of silliness about she's trying to prove she's upper crust and she's not. In America, the middle class wanted to become the upper class. And they had a real opportunity to do it. Instead of hating the upper class, in America, you could become a self-made millionaire. And so everybody, instead of trying to hate them and pull them down, everyone was trying to become them. And so that's been a lot of the move since the 1970s. It was in the 1970s, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was published in the West. And what we kind of forget is during the Vietnam War, not only were intellectuals anti-Vietnam, that was our focus at home, most of them were very pro-Soviet Union. Very pro-Soviet Union. And the publishing of the Gulag Archipelago and the work of a guy, probably none of us remember Malcolm Muggeridge. He was a British, you know him, a British journalist who was a true believer in Marxism till he went on a train tour through the Soviet Union. and you've heard the phrase Potemkin Village, where they make the the main street looks beautiful, and if you get out and walk to the street behind it, it's a complete mess. That's what they did in East Berlin for years, right? If you visited the officially approved parts of the city, everything looked great. If you went anywhere else, it looked like, well, they literally never repaired the damage from World War II. So he flipped on that. And he had a tremendous amount of influence in Great Britain and in American circles.
Now, who is that?
Malcolm Muggeridge. He also
becomes
very
a Roman Catholic, I think.
at the end of his
Very
life.
close to the end of
At
his
the end of his life,
yeah.
yeah. He first went from atheist, which is almost a requirement if you're a Marxist. He went from atheist to Christian and lived in the Church of England for many years. And right towards the end of his life became Roman Catholic, largely because the Church of England was flipping on the pro-life issue, and he wanted to be with the one church that hadn't flipped on pro-life. So anyway, these people were very influential, but the Gulag Archipelago was written by a Russian who had been through the system. He also had been a true believer, and he was sent to the gulags because they needed a fall guy for something he hadn't done. And his analysis was, and he became a Christian in the gulags. The guy who witnessed to him about Christ was murdered the night he gave his witness for giving it. He was assassinated by the guards that night for telling him about Jesus. Not surprisingly, it's endemic to Russia. He became an Orthodox Christian. But when he came, and after he'd finally been expatriated to the West, when he was finally ejected became so much pressure. Some of his writings had been leaked. A lot of political pressure was brought to bear, and he was brought to America. He presented at Harvard. He was booed off the stage. He was booed down at Harvard because he was basically telling them that Marxism has failed everywhere it's been tried, and it forces and he did more than that. He did more than make a practical case against Marxism. He said it was evil because it forced the people to lie, and that was his major insight. If you read the Gulag Archipelago, was that he had participated in propping up the system, and everybody participated. That what made the Soviet Union evil was that everybody was lying all the time. And it forced everybody to lie all the time. And the minute you told the truth, you went to the Gulag. And so he was making the moral case against Marxism. Well, what happened was that as he did that, Marxism suddenly, you couldn't be pro-Soviet Union like you could be in 1968 by 1972. There was too much information about what they were doing to people. So the committed Marxists moved from talking about class to pulling that into race and sexuality, because the only book that Engels ever wrote apart from Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto together. The only book that Engels ever wrote apart from Marx was Anti-Family. It was about destroying the family because the family was the bulwark that would keep the revolution from happening. You had to break the attachment of children to their parents and parents to their children so they would be willing to kill and turn each other in for the sake of the revolution. Only then could the revolution truly go forward. So that's the moment we're in right now. And if it feels like things are really vicious, it's because the institutions have largely flipped Marxist, especially the tech institutions. I mean, somebody asked, was it Twitter? One of the big ones, might have been Instagram. Asked the CEO what the culture was like. Oh, it's commie as hell, he said. And this is something that all our young people, not just our young people in the United States, but young people all over the world used to communicate with each other. But the people pulling the strings behind the kids sharing their videos are purposely moving all the kids towards Marxism because that's what they believe in. Which is weird to me because they're Marxists at the exact same time they're making gobs of money using straight up capitalism to make that. But that's why you have to move their analysis from class, because if they kept it in class, they would realize they're the bad guys according to the Marxist thing. But if they move it over to talk about sex or talk about race, well, then we can still pat ourselves on the back for being the good guys, while we make it harder and harder. For instance, for a young couple to buy a home in this area is almost impossible, which it wouldn't have been 50 years ago, right? Because all the money coming into this area is from California and New York, and it's all tech-driven. So it's very much about class still. I think Mark's got his, in many ways, not every way, I think Mark's got his analysis right and his prescription wrong. But he was right to note how bad things were for average people and the workers in 19th century. We're way far afield from the Bible at this point, I apologize. But this gives you a background of some of what's going on in our culture right now.
But we're not, because people say, well, I don't know where, but Jesus was talking about that sisters would be against sisters, and families would be torn apart.
Right. Well, and the reason for that is, again, contextualize it where when he says, I came not to bring peace but a sword, what that means is the families are going to be split based on their commitment to him.
Oh,
Okay? One mom is going to say he's the Messiah, dad's going to say he's not. That's a hard thing to come together over. Or children and parents and whatever. And you see this as the Bible goes on. We saw it in the book of Acts regularly, right? You see families getting broken wide open and stuff like this, such to the fact that you can see the early class was reflecting on 2 Timothy, a section of that, so we were talking about teaching the kids how to read for context, right?
so he was not encouraging it, he was just warning you.
He was just saying this is what the truth does.
happen.
The truth divides people, as well as lies do. Lies can divide people too, but a lie is doing it purposefully. The truth divides because it doesn't allow you a place to hide. This is why John uses this consistent language of light and darkness. When you bring a light into the room, you take the shadows away. But if you like shadows, you hate the light. And so that's the difficulty, is that, and then it amplifies for Christians because we are not allowed to hate our enemies. In fact, we don't have any enemies potentially because God's not against people, God's against sin. And so we are required not only sometimes to fight against people who want to promote sin, we're required to love them enough to realize that they're in bondage to the sin we're fighting against. They may be promoting something. So I'm reading a book on the sexual revolution right now. It's a wonderful history written by a guy who's been in charge of studying this issue for 50 years. So this is like the culmination of his life's work now. He's a bishop from Australia. And he starts by saying, he dedicates the book to the victims of the sexual revolution, and he says many of them don't think they're victims. But I hope in the course of this book to explain why they are, and why they should view themselves that way, and why they should set themselves free from it. But he knows he's got an uphill battle to face, and I love the book because you can tell he's talked with these people for 50 years that he disagrees with. He understands their point of view, and he doesn't belittle it. He doesn't talk down about them. But he says, here's why I think you're wrong. First, I'll say what I think you believe, and then I'm going to tell you why I think that's wrong.
Who is this guy?
I knew you'd ask, and I can't remember his name.
What's the name of the book?
I'll give it to you in just a second.
Okay.
I got to pull up my Kindle.
But a lot of people think that these problems in America are of
Yes.
recent origin. These go back decades and decades and decades.
To the French
I mean,
Revolution. So
you
that's
know,
200 years
long,
almost at this.
long
Better than
time.
200 years, right? Yeah.
And it's kind of an insidious, and you can see how it's.
Well, it's been growing.
Mhm.
It's been growing, especially amongst the intelligentsia.
Mhm.
But, when I was young, I fairly naively thought that America was run from the bottom up because we all had a vote. But what they've come to realize, any system, not just America, but any system, you control it from the top down. There are nodes of influence. So if you could change this node, it changes 5 things around it. So that's the way so our democracy is only as good as whether you have reliable information, right? Well, that's why historically journalism was always called the fourth estate. The idea was that you've got the 3 branches of government, but you make sure they work properly because journalism reports the facts. But modern journalism, this is literal now. I'm not speaking out of turn because I heard a guy from the New York Times say this, one of their major reporters. He says, you are allowed to report with bias. That is perfectly ethical to report using bias.
Why?
Because they said so. It's called Fox's. It's called Fox's watching hen houses. Is what it's called.
Yeah, exactly.
So yes, it's not good, but when you have that. Okay, so the book is called "The Sexual Revolution: History, Ideology, Power. And it's written by Peter J. Elliott. So, in any event, these are some of the things we're fighting, but to take it back to your original question, scholars aren't always after the truth per se. Theoretically they are, but a lot, especially in the liberal arts, modern theory of knowledge says, and this is again very Marxist, comes from a guy named Derrida in France. His idea was that when you claim to be talking about the truth, you're not doing that. All you're trying to do is impose your will on me. So you don't need to. All that we're doing is fencing with words, but all I'm trying to do is put you down, and all you're trying to do is put me down. It's just a power struggle. That's Marxism. Marxism says everything's a power struggle, and there's nothing else going on. Now, the truth does exert power. The truth is against falsehood, but the classical idea, and the classical idea has never denied that, but it always said there's something higher than our power struggle, and that's where we both bow to the truth. So that's that takes us back to why you're going to have all these arguments. Some people in the church don't want the Bible to be true, right?
Right.
I mean,
Well,
really. I mean, Bishop Pike was making news in the 70s about denying the virgin birth and doing all this kind of stuff back when it was still like, oh, I can't believe a bishop's saying that. And then John Shelby Spong came along and basically said everything we do in the church is wrong, right? When the Sparkle Creed made the news back in July, I must have had 5 members of the church come up to me and ask me about it. So I'm going to write about it. It'll be in the October newsletter. You know,
in the what?
the Sparkle Creed.
Oh,
It's an inversion of like the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed. It's written in a similar fashion, but it came from a UCC pastor, wrote it in 2021. Some Lutheran church broadcasting it used it for a Pride Month presentation or for a Pride Month worship service. So,
well, I'm sorry, check this.
Yeah.
Yeah, Elizabeth Holmes was it? The gal that made the machine that didn't work. The blood test machine, and she went to jail.
oh yeah.
Mhm.
Is it Elizabeth Holmes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the meantime, she had 2 babies,
Right.
family oriented.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she went from a very Marxist, she was, what's his name, Jobs? She became like a man, she had a deep voice, and she
Oh, okay.
came in and,
Okay.
you know, her persona.
Right.
And then, all of a sudden, she's the mother of the year, and she's family oriented.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the politics of it, right? That's the promotion of a
Yeah.
particular agenda at the expense of truth. So,
Okay.
yeah. So I'm not all that familiar with Elizabeth Holmes, but I know that what's his name or her name or whatever you would call they made all the noise with Budweiser a couple months ago. Budweiser decided to put him on the cans as a poster girl. But he hasn't even had a surgical transition. He just presents himself like a woman, claims to be a woman. I forgot the guy's name. Anyway.
Bud Light. That's what, yeah.
Yeah, it was. You're right. That's what he was advertising,
Oh,
yeah.
I thought you were saying that was his name.
No, I can't remember his name. He was the one who starred in that Book of Mormon when it was making all the splash. So, yeah. Okay, well, we're going to move over to worship.